But as you think back a couple weeks, I know that's hard because it's hard to remember what happened yesterday. So we're going to kind of go back. The story of Jephthah, when God told him he was going to have victory over the Ammonites, who was an enemy of Israel in the land of Canaan. And God promised him victory, and then Jephthah at the very end said, okay, I want to make sure I got this right. I want to add to your promise, and I'm going to give you a vow that whatever comes out of my tent after I return from victory, I'm going to dedicate to you as a burnt offering. And that turned tragic when he returned after the victory of war, and his daughter came out of the tent and met him after the war, and he dedicated her through a burnt offering, which was really messed up because God didn't ask him to give an extra vow. God said, trust me in the victory is yours, and yet he added to that. And so that was on a personal level, that the victory that God gave Israel over the Ammonites was tainted. And now we're going to look at a national level taint of human pride and just men messing up things that God has for them on a national level. That's today's story. And so we're going to learn. We learned on a personal level from Jephthah. We're going to learn on a national level from the Israelites, namely Ephraim. Ephraim is a tribe of Israel. The Gileadites were led by Jephthah to have victory over the Ammonites, and so they defeated that, and then they came home. And now another tribe of Israel is going to bow up against the Gileadites. And so we're going to look and see what that looks like starting in Judges 12. So look at Judges 12 starting in verse 1. It said, the men of Ephraim were called to arms. They basically called themselves to arms. And they crossed to the Zephon and said to Jephthah, why did you cross over to fight against the Ammonites and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house over you with fire. Now that's a great return from war, right? You just have victory. You just realize that your daughter is going to be sacrificed because of your mess up and a rash vow. And now a nation or tribe of Israel rises up, comes against Jephthah and says, hey, why didn't you call us out when you went to war against the Ammonites? And then they add a little bit to it and said, because you didn't, we will burn your house over you with fire. It's like, thanks, brother. Where'd this come from? Now, if you think back, this is not the first time we've entertained Jephthah, right? Jephthah and Gideon had a similar encounter where, the first time we've encountered Ephraim and Gideon had a similar exchange when Gideon returned from battle, and Ephraim came to him and said, hey, why didn't you include us in battle? Because they wanted the spoils of war. And Gideon gave him the soft answer, right? And basically flattered them and made the situation go away. Now Ephraim's back after the victory over Ammon and says, why didn't you include us in the battle? We're going to destroy you. And they're going to get a different response from Jephthah than they did from Gideon. Verse 2. Jephthah said to them, I and my people had a great dispute with the Ammonites, and when I called you, you did not save me from their hand. And when I saw that you did not save me, I took my life in my hand and crossed over against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me? And so Jephthah's response to Ephraim is, hey, we did call you up, and we did ask you to be a part of the battle. Now, here we go, the same thing with the Rich talked about a couple weeks ago, truth. The king of Ammon had his truth of history, and Jephthah had the true truth of history and God's hand in Israel. And now the Ephraimites are operating out of their truth of nobody called us to battle, and Jephthah's like, yes, we did. So it's got the he said, she said kind of thing going on. But Jephthah is going to now confront truth with action. And he basically says, look, we did call you up and you didn't answer, so we took it upon ourselves to enter war with the Ammonites, and God gave us victory because God was over the campaign in the first place. So let me ask you a question. The Ammonites have been around for 18 years. Why didn't you ever been called to arms since then? I mean, they've been oppressing us all this time, and you haven't done anything about it. Why, now that we have victory, are you bowing up against your brothers of Gilead? The sad part about it was that because Ephraim was called up to battle against the Ammonites and they chose not to, and now they're bowing up against the Gileadites, they were more interested in fighting against their brothers in Israel than they were fighting the true enemy. And ain't that a picture of the church sometimes? We're more interested in what we don't agree on and fighting amongst ourselves, then we're really focused on fighting the spiritual battle that's behind all that, to say, you know what, we have a true enemy and we should be devoting our focus on him and the things that he's doing rather than infighting amongst ourselves. That's messed up. And even worse is when it comes to a local body and a local church family and there's infighting against family members, and that consumes so much attention and so much, resources and emotion that becomes the focus, and we forget about the true enemy, and much less our call to go share the love of Christ with the community. And so we got to be aware that the enemy's scheme is for us to come against each other instead of be focused with loving each other and doing what we're supposed to be doing, called to share the gospel with those that don't know who Jesus is yet. And Ephraim, this is their second time of bowing up against a brother and saying, why didn't we get to participate in the war? When both times they were called to arms, and really all they really cared about was the spoils of war. They didn't really care about fighting the war. They just were mad that they weren't going to collect all the extras. So Jephthah confronts him with truth, and then because they threaten him to burn his house down over him, responds in verse 4 by gathering all the men of Gilead and fighting against Ephraim. Now you get a picture of this. These are God's people, two tribes of God, of Israel, fighting against each other, not just like arguing. This is a war. The men of Gilead struck Ephraim because they said, you are fugitives of Ephraim, you Gileadites, in the midst of Ephraim and Manasseh. The Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites, and when any of the fugitives of Ephraim said, let me go over, the men of Gilead said to them, are you an Ephraimite? When he said no, they said to him, then say Shibboleth. And the Ephraimites would say Sibboleth. We could go there, but we won't. Y'all. For they could not pronounce it right. Then they seized him and slaughtered him at the fords of the Jordan, and at that time 42,000 of Ephraimites fell. Jephthah judged for 6 years, and Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in the city of Gilead. So you got to get this picture of the Ephraimites bowing up against Jephthah, him summoning the people of Gilead to come fight, and 42,000 Ephraimites were destroyed because of their pride and because of their desire to have spoils and not participate in the war. And this whole thing about when they secured the fords is they basically were cutting off this pass between the two places, and they would just systematically, individually weed out the Ephraimites. Say Shibboleth. And the Ephraimites could not say the SH pronunciation, and they would say Sibboleth, and they would destroy him right there at the ford. And just think about God's heart as they individually took off these Ephraimites because of the pride and because of them bowing up against what God was doing with the Gileadites. You can't even imagine it. And so 42,000 of these people of Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim, were destroyed after God gave Gilead victory over the Ammonites, their true enemy. Now they're destroying one another because of this pride. And that's why we said 2 weeks ago that as the cycle of sin and redemption came through Judges, now we start seeing the spiral of sin. Because now Israel had spiraled down to the fact that now they're fighting each other instead of focus on who the true enemy is. And they're destroying one another because of their pride. And as a result, really, it's because of their idolatry that they had found themselves in. But we think about our pride, it's hard to not deal with pride. We all got it, right? Some of us hide it better than others. We talked about it a couple of months ago. I'm a very good hider of pride. So people go, oh, Jim, you're so humble. And it's like, dude, you don't even know. So much pride. But pride goes before destruction. And Ephraim's pride led to the destruction of 42,000 people. So our pride leads to the destruction and the wake of destruction of people all around us. It's just whether we're willing enough to open up our eyes to see what that looks like. So it's interesting. I had written down this verse a couple of days ago, And then Beth goes, last night, she's sitting on the couch, she goes, what's that verse about counting others better than yourselves? I'm like, that's random, right? Romans 12:3. For the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. And so it leads off with God's grace, saying by God's grace we have to realize who we are and what we are, that it's not because of ourselves. The people of Ephraim were not a tribe of God because they were great people. They were people of God because God chose them as a people. But they had forgotten that. And so now they got all this pride going, oh man, we should have been participating in this war and we should have gotten all the spoils of war. And because we didn't, we're going to now bow up against our own blood. And the result of that is their destruction. So it's all about God's grace. But when we forget about God's grace in our lives, then it's easy to get that pride, like, oh, I'm something. So we're not supposed to think more highly than we think. Does that mean we think low of ourselves? No, just don't think more highly than you ought to. Don't whatever that is. Don't tear yourself down. Oh, I'm building other people up. No, you're ripping yourself apart. By God's grace, think of yourself who you are, but not too high of yourself. With sober judgment, according to the faith that God's given. So God desires that we treat one another and build one another up and respect one another as we submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And Ephraim didn't get that lesson. So they paid the consequences of that lesson. And so for us, we should learn the consequences of that lesson so we don't have to repeat that lesson, so that we don't have destruction follow our pride, that we can humble ourselves now. Now after this occurred, Jephthah lived another 6 years, and then he died, then he buried, and then there's just a succession of judges that we don't know a whole lot about. But they're in here for a reason, so we're going to read through them in verse 8. It said, after Jephthah, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters and gave in marriage outside of his clan. And the 30 daughters he brought in from outside for his sons. And he judged Israel 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried in Bethlehem. So this guy only judged for 7 years. He had a lot of kids, which kind of leads to the fact that he had probably many wives. And the problem with this was that he gave his kids outside of the clans, outside of the tribes. And they brought sons in, and they let their daughters go out, which was not God's plan. Then in verse 10, he died and was buried. Really short timeline. After him, Elon, the Zebulite, judged Israel, and he judged Israel 10 years. And Elon the Zebulite died and was buried at Ayalon in the land of Zebulun. And after him, Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons. He rode on 70 donkeys, and he judged Israel 8 years. Then Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, died and was buried at Parathon in the land of Ephraim in the hill country of Amalekites. And so these guys are just successively listed. This is a guy, he ruled this many years, he had this much family. Not a whole lot about the deeds of the nation. There wasn't a whole lot going on in the deeds of the nation, although we do know that they enjoyed a time of peace. They definitely didn't enjoy a time of rest, which about 3 weeks ago I said we're going to zero in on that in some form or fashion down the road, which has ended up being today. So next week we get introduced to the last judge, Samson, and then from there on it just really basically deals with the nation of Israel for the rest of the book of Judges. But in quick succession, these guys lived, these guys died, and their family histories are recorded. And accounting for Jephthah all the way through these three guys was 25 years of peace. A time of peace, but no mention of rest. Why not? How can you enjoy a time of peace but not have rest? And what's the difference between the two? Well, even though they had a time of peace, they were still stuck in spiritual idolatry. They were still focused on the wrong things. And they were living a life of prosperity more than likely because these guys that are recorded their families had donkeys, which is a sign of royalty. They had many family members, which is a sign of prosperity. And so there's good things going on these 25 years, but unfortunately the people of Israel weren't where they were supposed to be with God. But as we focus on Judges, it's so easy sometimes to focus on the people of Israel rather than God himself. Even the Judges. Our focus is so much on Jephthah and, man, he messed up and this and that. But the truth of the matter is God delivered Israel from the Ammonites. And even though Ephraim bowed up and came against Gileadites, God still gave him the victory. And he still gave him a time of peace. And so we've got to kind of reshift our focus when we look at Judges, especially in instances like this where it's just a bunch of names and a bunch of times and a bunch of family and a bunch of dates, and say, where's God in all this? So last week we went and worshiped with our friends in New Orleans, and we started singing this song, and the lyrics to the song said that Jesus is worthy of his name. And it just like hit me right across the face, because when we sing songs, Jesus is worthy of our what? Praise. Jesus is worthy of our worship. Jesus is worthy of our fill in the blank. But the truth of the matter is, all those are only true because Jesus is worthy of his name. So Jesus' worthiness is not built around man. Jesus' worthiness is built on who he is. And I was like, man, I forget that so many times, because when I sing, I think of me giving worth to Jesus because he's worthy of my worship. But if I take myself out of the equation, he is still worthy of himself. I didn't hear anything the preacher said, but I'm chewing on that all weekend. But how many times do we get it backwards, and our focus is on us or man or the situations and circumstances around us, and we forget that Jesus is worthy of himself because of who he is, which makes God worthy of himself because of who he is, and the Spirit worthy of himself because of who he is. And so if we take that perspective against this in Judges, this chaos that Israel is going through and the position that God has put them in, there's great lessons to learn from it. Because they had 25 years of peace across the land, and they didn't take advantage of it. And so it doesn't really matter whether you're in a place of peace or in a place of transition or a place of chaos. Jesus is still worthy of his name. And Jesus is still who he is. And so we got to think back and say, why did God desire Israel to have rest in the first place? Why did God bring Israel out of Egypt in the very first place? And we're like, well, number one, because he heard of their suffering, right? He heard the cries, he heard the oppression, he heard the cries of his people, and he said, I want Moses to deliver my people. That is an aspect of why they were delivered, but why did Moses tell Pharaoh God wanted Israel delivered? Because he wanted them to go and worship him. He wanted to bring them out of bondage to a place of rest and peace for the sole purpose of them having the freedom to worship him for who he is and to know him for who he is. And so the whole promised land setup, the whole reason that he brought Israel from Egypt all the way across the Jordan to the promised land, all through Joshua, the book of Joshua, all through the Judges, the whole purpose of all that was so that they would get a God-centric view of life, and they would worship him for who he was. But where did they find themselves? They found themselves distracted and worshiping the idols of the land, just like we do. And so God's purpose was to bring them into rest so that they could know him and worship him fully. And as they spent seasons under foreign oppressions because of their sin, when God would set them free, they would return to that. And now they're in a season of no rest, although they're experiencing peace, and they find themselves fighting themselves rather than fighting their enemies. And I thought about that, and I thought back to a book that I read, probably 6 or 7 years ago called The Rest of God. And there was a couple of picture graphs in that book. The first one was a Chinese pictograph. Now, Mike Weaver could probably set this up a lot better than me. But in the Chinese language, they have pictures that mean certain things. And when you put different pictures together, it changes the word. And so the picture of busyness in the Chinese language is 2 symbols. One is the heart, and one is killing. You put heart and killing together, guess what word you get in the English language? Busyness. What were the Israelites doing to one another? They were killing one another. What do we do to ourselves through busyness? We kill our hearts. The Chinese nailed it. They didn't even have the English language to dwell on. But they're like, heart and killing, oh yeah, that equals busyness. And if the Western people would get that in their hearts, we'd be like, man, I'm killing myself. And we say it, but we don't understand the aspect of what's going on in our hearts. Which made me then jump over to the Swahili word for white man. Y'all remember that one? The one who spins around? And they nailed that one. White man? Oh yeah, they just spin in circles. Westerners? They don't get it. So you take the Chinese word, heart killing, you take the Swahili word for white man, one who spins around, and we see them parallel one another, that our spinning around creates a busyness that kills our hearts. Why? Because we're so distracted with so many different things, which is exactly where Israel found themselves as they worshiped all these different idols of the land and did exactly what God told them not to do, and they find themselves killing one another and experiencing no rest, even in a time of peace. When God's ordained plan for Israel was that they go to the promised land to experience this one thing that he had for them, rest. And we ask the question, does God still want that for us? And my answer is yeah. They forgot why they were delivered, and they forgot why they were in the promised land, to experience rest, to worship God. And we forget why we were delivered, why God transferred us from darkness to light, from death to life. Why? So that we'd experience his rest and worship him fully. So we got to ask ourselves, what's rest? Now, if you read the newsletter, you got a little heads up. If you didn't, we'll give you the cheater notes right here. Rest involves a ceasing to strive. Rest is the ability to be quiet and settled without disturbance. The rest that God offers has to do with our hearts rather than our circumstances. So the literal definition of rest is to cease that which is necessary. We're like, that's irresponsible. For a time, to stop doing what you ought to do, because the oughts never cease. There's always more oughts. I ought to do this. I ought to get off the couch and do this. I ought to get going and do this. But when we take leave of those things that we ought to do, guess what we're doing? We're trusting God with those things. Now, we're not talking about being irresponsible and saying, oh, honey, I didn't wake up and feed the kids this morning because I just figured I'd rest. We get away with that all the time as guys, right? Works for us. But it's a period of time where God says, yeah, you ought to do this, but instead, trust me with that. That takes faith. That's understanding God's grace and the measure given through faith. Now, what I found out over the last 2 weeks is rest is not associated with leisure time. Rest is not taking vacation in the Capel household. All-nighters. I'm too old for all-nighters, but we did it twice. Driving thousands of miles. That is not rest. It was awesome, and we enjoyed every second of it with all of our family, but that is not rest. But how many of us say, I just need to take vacation, right? Vacation, that's the answer to my issues. That's an answer to an issue, but that is not the answer to rest. Because most of us know when you get back from vacation, what do you got to do? You got to rest. Because you've been going hard. Rest is not a reward for finishing. Because we're never going to finish. It's not, I completed all of my to-do list and now it's time for me to rest. That will never happen. That doesn't even happen when you take 2 weeks of vacation. My to-do list is still unchecked. But you know what? I'm going. And I'm trusting God with the things that I can't do anything about, and I'm trusting Marie with the rest of it. And praise God for Marie. Rest is not a bonus for well-done work. It's not a reward. It's a gift from God. And here's the clincher. It's not just a gift from God, it's a command of God. And we can laugh about rest, we can hope for rest, but until we get to the fact that we understand that God commanded rest, not whole much is going to change in our life. If God commanded it, then we need to embrace it. I read this week. It says, we need to stop creating and focus on enjoying what's already created. It's like, dude, that'll preach. I should put that over my mirror. Stop creating something and enjoy what God has already done. Now, because there's always more to do. But sometimes we just need to take a pause and say, I'm just going to reflect and enjoy what God has already done before I go do more. Because Jephthah had relied on what God had already done. He in no way would have ever added that vow of his daughter to the victory list. He would have enjoyed God's victory and allowed that to be enough. And sometimes we just need to allow what God's done to be enough without trying to add to it. So what happened to rest? Why did we have such a hard time as Westerners embracing this rest? And I would just have to say, it's probably because we within the church allowed rest to become a law. You heard it, right? You shall obey the Sabbath. And that's a law. On the Sabbath, you shouldn't do this, or this. It became a list of don'ts, do's, instead of a gift from God of the freedom of what we can do. So when Jesus came on the scene, guess what he got in trouble for? Rest. Because the religious leaders at that time had defined what rest was and what rest wasn't. And if you picked up something too heavy, you're not resting. But if you pick up something light enough, you're good. And we as men and ladies created this list of do's and don'ts of what rest was and what rest wasn't. And if you were raised in that kind of environment, guess what? We wanted to run as far away from that as we could because we didn't do the list very well. And when we heard rest, all we heard was, you ain't doing it right. And so we allowed the rest of God to become a law of God, and we missed its intent. We missed God's heart behind it. So that when Jesus got busted on the Sabbath for doing things that the religious leaders said he shouldn't do, his response to them was that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. God created Sabbath for our benefit, for our enjoyment. The Sabbath wasn't created to dominate and domineer over man like a authoritative dictator, busting us every time we did something that wasn't rest. The Sabbath was created so that we could enjoy all of God for all he had for us. And they didn't get that. And then Jesus went on to say, so even the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So Jesus threw him off and said, look, if in doubt, refer to me. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And so if you are walking with me, if you're dwelling with me, if you're hanging out with me, guess what? You're going to find what God has for you, even on the Sabbath, even when it comes to this rest. Because God gave us the Sabbath for our sake, because of how good he is, to replenish us and to fulfill us. But we took it as a punishment of God, a restriction of God, the law of God. And so we missed it completely. Gee, I wonder who was behind that. And we spent so much time and effort trying to keep the law, or keep the Sabbath, or keep rest, that we lost it. So when we learned from a generation before us, we just buried it and said, oh, I guess the Sabbath doesn't apply to us anymore, even though it's one of the 10 Commandments. And we wrote it off. And God says, I want you to re-look at, reevaluate, and know that it's a command of mine for your benefit. Because Israel wasn't getting it. And the church today, most of us don't get it. Now, one thing about rest is, if you're striving or wrestling with God, you're not going to get rest. What is striving and wrestling due to? Unbelief. And so if we say, oh, I'll get to that rest as soon as I can get this taken care of. Guess what that is? Unbelief that God can take care of this while you do that. And the Bible says that Israel never entered into rest because of what? Unbelief. And so in the same way, on a personal level, if I don't believe God and trust God for the things that he's going to do while I take the time to do what he's asked me to do or commanded me to do, then I'll never experience that. And there'll be this constant wrestling with me and God. Trust, not trust. Trust, not trust. Rest, striving. Rest, striving. And we won't find what God has for us. But by trusting God, then we'll find that. Now, something happened on our trip that was completely off base, and it was so funny. I said to friends of ours, they set up this bow fishing trip. And I'm like, I don't know how to shoot a bow, and I'm not a very good fisherman, but I'm with my boys. It's going to be good. And so I said to this guy, I said, hey, let me help out with this bow hunting trip, like financially. And he looked at me and he goes, no, you don't want any part of that. Like that's off your scale. Like, don't even bring that up again. So humbly, we said, okay, we're in. So we get going, and we show up at this landing, and this guy that talked foreign, Cajun, shows up in an airboat that's bigger than my house. He passes out the compound bows. He gives us some do's and the don'ts. Don't shoot each other, and don't lose my junk. And he sets us free to go shoot fish in the water. And I'm like going, what? This is going to have to be God if I ever shoot anything. Well, there you go. God gave me a bone. All right? So, but that's not the point of this thing. So I had never handled a compound bow before. So there's like, this is new information. And I thought about that song, when's the last time you did something for the first time? You country guys will get that. I did something for the first time, and I'm like, this is really cool. It's fun to learn something new. But as I was learning this, I realized this is going to take a lot of time and effort to get good at. So I'm just going to have fun. But as I did that, I experienced something that I'd heard about, but I had never experienced firsthand. And you guys that have shot bows before, you'll get this. But when you pull a compound bow back, it is tough to get some pressure to get a compound bow back to where it needs to be, right? But once you get it in its sweet spot, it's not tough anymore. So I'm chewing on that the whole trip going, it is such a good place to be in this sweet spot. Knowing that when I let go of this sweet spot, this arrow is going to go zinging out of my hand and hopefully into this monster redfish or this crazy alligator gar that we're hunting. But the anticipation of letting go of that bow was like awesome. Like, I don't care if I shoot anything. I'm just sitting there going, and I'm throwing bows all over the place. And maybe a blind hog will get an acorn one of the times, right? But Bradley and Brett, man, they're in the front, and they're just like taking every shot. And they are, Cameron, he's like calculating. And he's waiting on it for the perfect shot. Well, by the time Cameron gets the arrow off, man, Brett and Bradley have put 3 arrows into it because they are not holding back. They're just like letting them roll. So I'm like, I just need to let it roll. But I couldn't get past the sweet spot of the arrow. And I started thinking about rest. Now, that arrow was at a place of rest. It didn't take a whole lot of effort to hold that arrow in that place. And you ever heard that illustration of the archer? That the arrow is set on the target, right? But then the archer pulls the arrow away from the target, and we're like, wait, I'm going away from where I'm supposed to be going, right? And I'm going the opposite direction of the target, but when I get in the sweet spot, I'm poised for where the archer wants to send the arrow. And I'm in a place of rest. But as soon as that archer lets go of the arrow, what happens? Everything happens. And that arrow goes exactly where the archer's pointing that arrow to go with the velocity necessary to get to the target because the archer's in complete control. Now, my illustration isn't a perfect one because my arrow rarely got to the perfect place where it was supposed to go except for this one time and one other time, but that was an alligator gar and I don't really count it. But man, to watch Bradley and Brett put arrows into these fish, I'm like, that's exactly, every time they let go of the arrow, it's going where they want it to go. And I thought about how God, every time he lets go of the arrow, it goes exactly where it's supposed to go if we're in tune with what the archer wants to do. But if we're fighting against the drawback of, wait, I'm going I'm going the opposite way of the target. But what am I getting close to? Y'all have heard that illustration, right? You're getting close to the archer's face. Man, we're like knee deep in it, man. That arrow is right up in my face. At a place of rest for a purpose. Because as soon as I let go of that arrow, it took off in the direction it was supposed to take off. That's a picture of what God wants for us. We have this warped sense of rest of just being some couch potato somewhere doing something that is unproductive. And God's like, you got the messed up picture because you're so focused on busyness that you haven't investigated this place of rest. But this place of rest is intimacy and presence of God, poised in this place of calm to be shot out in the direction that God wants us to go. If it was at a place of rest in the unbowed position, guess what? I never would have shot a fish. And that's the majority of our rest understanding is this arrow and this compound bow in this inefficient, not even poised place. And we're like, oh yeah, well that would be the state of rest. It's going to be unproductive. But God goes, no, my rest is super productive because it's at a place of rest that's ready and waiting to be used in the way that God wants it to be ready and waiting. Hebrews 11. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Faith is understanding that God wants us to get in a place of rest that is of action and readiness, close to his face, further away from the target than when we started, so that when he says you're ready to fly, we're ready to fly. But that takes faith, because what do we do as the arrows? Oh, no. I'll get there. And we try to get out of the archer's hands, and we try to walk ourselves to the target, and we find ourselves frustrated and annoyed and confused and busy. And God's like, I'm still here. I'm ready to put you in the bow. And we got to make that decision of whether we're going to submit ourselves to him or whether we're going to do our own thing. One other quick illustration. On the way to out west, I don't even know where we went. We went to so many places. We stopped and visited a small group friend, a guy that I had served as elder with at our church plant in Alabama. And the week before we went out, he had got diagnosed with brain cancer. And they got operated on like 2 days later, and he recovered from the operation, but the surgeon said, I wasn't able to get all of it. So there's going to be some time that I'm going to give you. Like, I think this is your window of opportunity for life, but we can do treatment. And you hate when you get those kind of heads up, right? And we got the heads up right before we left town. We're like, well, we hope to see him anyway. We're going to spend time. We'll spend time chilling with him. But his wife said about Ken has had such peace from diagnosis until today. It had been maybe 2 weeks by then. And he looks at me and he's like, it is what it is. And I know who I know, and I know where I'm going. And it was just, not just peace, but he was at rest. And I thought, that is definitely a gift from God. Now, his wife's like, I ain't there yet. I don't have peace, and I don't have rest. But I'm learning from my husband of what that looks like. And I'm asking God to give me some of that as I experience it firsthand. Now, the cool part of that story is that as we were with them, they shared that there was some discrepancies between what the surgeon presented and what the pathology people presented initially, because they both said straight out of the box, it's brain cancer. The surgeon doing the surgery and the pathology confirming the surgery while they're doing it, And they were both in perfect place of saying, yes, this is brain cancer. But they did a follow-up to what they had taken out, and the pathology report came back and said, it's not brain cancer. So they're like, we need to do it again because we know it was brain cancer. And so they ran the tests again through their labs, and they came back after they said, just slow down, do it extensively, and they came back and they said, it's not brain cancer. So like, okay, we don't trust ourselves, so we're now going to send this information over to Shands. We're going to send the tissues and the samples over to Shands because they were in Pensacola. And Shands came back and they said, no, it's not brain cancer. The surgeon goes, I know it was brain cancer. And I know the pathology report confirmed it was brain cancer. And the cool thing is, she's a believer, and she goes, so what I understand is, as I was operating on you and I took brain cancer out of you, God transformed what was taken out and what was still in to not be brain cancer. And Ken's like, see? I was at peace the whole time. I don't know what you guys were worried about. Now, did Ken know that he didn't have brain cancer? No. But he had peace and rest through the process. And the rest of us are like, really? But Ken never missed a beat of the rest of God that God had for him. And now he was poised and ready to be shot out in the direction that God has for him because they came back and says, dude ain't got brain cancer. But how many times do we miss the rest of God because we're so focused on the circumstances around us that and you know what? Even if he had not gotten the second diagnosis, even if it was brain cancer with a term on his life, Ken still would have had rest. He still would have walked out peace because that's where he was with his God. And he was a great example of don't let the things of this world distract you and heart kill you and the busyness of life that we can't just trust God with, man, what? The next deadline, the next report, the next whatever in our lives? When we've already trusted him with eternity? So, this week we're celebrating what? Freedom. So let me encourage you Wednesday morning, before you bust up the barbecue, before you jump in the pool, before you get all your cronies together and you start hanging out, celebrating with fireworks, let me encourage you to, in the morning, before maybe anybody else gets up out of bed, slip away and rest with God. To just get into his presence and just say, God, I am tired of my heart being killed by busyness. I am weary in this situation. I am weary in this season. I am weary in this relationship. And I just need to experience your rest. And rest is only available through being in the presence of God. So just invite his presence. God, come in and bring the rest that you promised me. Because it's your plan. It's your desire. So you know you're playing completely into God's will. He won't go, oh no, it's not my will today. It's always God's will that we enter into his rest. So as you celebrate freedom, begin it with freedom to rest. If you got to work Wednesday morning, you can still rest. If you get bad news Tuesday night, you can still rest. It's a perspective of our heart. It's a chance to pause, to reflect, to rest. So I thought about, well, what's the opposite of rest? And I just used it probably 4 times. Weariness. Now, how many of y'all know weariness? You're just like, I'm done. I'm tapped out. I'm over it. So what's Jesus say? Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary, or you who labor, depending on the translation, and are heavy laden. So Jesus sets the stage. Hey, are you weary? Are you laboring to the point of exhaustion? Are you busy? Are you heavy laden with an instance or a circumstance or a situation that you're tired of carrying? Does that define you? He doesn't then turn and go, good luck with that. He says, come to me, and I promise to give you rest. Now, take him at his word. Write it down. Matthew 11:28. Jesus, you said to come to you because I'm experiencing this, and you promised me rest. Now, just like we shouldn't define the reward that God offers us, we shouldn't define the rest that God offers us either. So say, I want the rest that you have for me today. Then Jesus says, oh, well, you know what? There's some drawing back we got to do to get to this place of rest. You got to take my yoke. You got to learn from me, which means you got to know me. You got to know that I'm gentle. You got to know that I'm lowly of heart, which is the opposite of pride, because in pride there's no rest. And you will find rest for your souls. So Jesus says, you got to get into the compound bow. And you got to allow me to bring it back. And you got to take that yoke upon me. Because that yoke yokes us up with him. That yoke puts us in position of him. And now we're close to his face. And now you got to learn from me. You got to learn that your ways aren't my ways. And I'm going to do this different from how you would do it. And the rest that I have for you is way better than the rest you have for yourself, because you define rest as vacation or leisure or taking a day off. I define rest in a completely different way. So you got to learn my rest. And that rest is gentle, and that rest is lowly in heart. And my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. So the good news is we don't have to wait till Wednesday to do that. We're going to do it right now. And I'm going to encourage you, if you're weary in ministry, I want you to come up front. If you're weary in relationships, or you're weary in business, I want you to come up front. God says there's rest available. Now, the rest is available in your seats too, right? But there's something about saying, you know what? I need that. And if you need that, just come up and, man, there's places that are comfortable to kneel at. Take advantage of it. And listen to the words of the song as if Jesus was singing over you, because he is. Matthew 11:28-30. Come to me if you're weary. If you need rest, come to me.